It's hard to imagine what terrifies us. To find our fears is a tremendous task. Yet a single genre in fiction can make us more anxious and terrified than any other. Horror is what makes us feel that spike of adrenaline. The hairs on the back of your neck stand up. It's incredibly fascinating that a piece of fiction has the ability to replicate and evoke such a primitive instinct like fear. These games can often lead us into states of unease, of terror, of anxiousness, and it's not easy to accomplish this. Video game developers have been constantly trying to find new ways of evoking fear out of you, and they can't rely on the same gimmicks time and time again, so they have to switch things up. For example, Resident Evil 7 completely reinvented the series, taking it from a badass zombie shooter into a claustrophobic one that made you terrified at the sound of a door squealing, or sudden footsteps behind you. Amnesia went from a helpless, insanity-filled nightmare to a way more grounded and darker take on horror that, after years of not giving you a way to fight back, finally lets you do so. This genre is also incredibly popular amongst indie developers. Some of the biggest franchises till this day were originally just low-budget passion projects. The guy who created a Goliath in this industry by pouring their heart out into a final attempt at game development, or a singular developer beating some of the most played games out there in terms of player counts by creating a game that's entirely unique and accessible to all players. But there's one other scenario that often gets overlooked. The case of a talented and well-known studio releasing a game that, even just a few years after its release, is sadly forgotten about. That is exactly what happened to an incredibly underrated and downright beautiful survival horror game called The Evil Within 2. It is genuinely tragic that such a beautifully stylized and emotionally compelling game was brushed off and forgotten after it was released. I'm gonna be completely honest here. In my other videos, I specifically try to delve into things to add on to the topic. But with this game, it would just feel entirely wrong to divert attention elsewhere. This game is genuinely one of my favorites of all time. But from what I've seen, it still has been disregarded for years on end, despite reviews always being quite positive. Just 3 years after the first game in the series was released, the sequel was a new side to the story, a more personal experience. This game, if it would have been pushed just a little bit further, could have sat above so many others and hail as a survival horror masterpiece, and in my eyes, it did absolutely that. The Evil Within 1 and 2 are not flawless games by any means, and they're also very different. The director of the first game wasn't directing anymore, acting as a producer and supervisor this time around. But what the sequel experienced was entirely unjust. It does have faults, of course, but the atmosphere, the soundtrack, the world building, practically everything about this game screams survival horror. And at the peak of this game, it not only terrifies you, but brings you into incredibly beautiful scenes. This game deserved better. The Evil Within was released back in October of 2014, with the reception being positive overall, combining many elements from the earlier Resident Evil games and bringing new aspects. Director Shinji Mikami, who had directed multiple titles for Capcom, once again showed audiences why he is still regarded as the father of survival horror. In terms of sales, The Evil Within was a success, with over 2 million copies sold up to today. Yet its big brother, the successor, wasn't so fortunate due to some bad marketing, poor timing in terms of the reveal of the game, and critical reception. It barely sold half of what the first game did. Years after it was released, this game still continues to be divisive. Lots of people don't like it for very valid reasons. The Evil Within 2 isn't in any way all sunshines and rainbows. It still has faults that are hard to overlook when you first step into this crumbling artificial world known as Union. Some of the dialogue feels fake, the open world starts to become somewhat repetitive, but this game's cons are merely a temporary hindrance to an overarching plot filled with the messages of family and sacrifice. A man's quest to go to hell and back to save the ones he loves. To sacrifice his own humanity to save another's. Sebastian Castellanos is not a unique protagonist by nature. He's naive on many fronts, driven by emotion a bit too often, and rough around the edges after what happened at Beacon, and after losing his wife and daughter. But his tale is one that I've always been fascinated by. The theme of a father trying to preserve and save whatever family he has left is grounded and personal. It's right here in this moment. While the world of Union is falling apart and is trapping anyone inside to die, Sebastian simply doesn't care. He's not there to restore balance. He's not there to aid Mobius in recapturing this artificial world. He's there for his own selfish yet selfless reasons. This is why I think Evil Within 2 is so unique. Its way of portraying these characters and the development they go through is incredibly gripping. In one of the game's most pivotal points, Sebastian falls into the Animus world once again. An enemy that torments its victims by forcing them to encounter their worst traumas and fears. For Sebastian, this is facing down what happened at Beacon Mental Hospital and the trauma that followed. After multiple encounters with Anima, she becomes more violent and desperate to make him succumb to her efforts. And at the end of this encounter, Sebastian witnesses his past self, muttering words about the guilt he carries. This provokes Sebastian to realize his biggest flaw yet. The fact that he blames himself for all of the misfortunes in his life. The suspected death of his wife and daughter, the sacrifices many have made for him, and how it led to their demise. He finally does what he's needed to do all along to let go of that guilt, so he can finally escape this mental torture. The dominant type of horror in The Evil Within 2 differs from the common fears we experience in other horror games. It isn't the claustrophobic fear of the Baker family in Resident Evil 7, or the helplessness of Amnesia. It's a fear of losing everything you have. I mean, of course there are scary or even better, terrifying sequences in this game that will make you stop breathing in anticipation. But this game, compared to its predecessor, isn't as focused on scaring the player directly, as much as it is doing it through the story. This game isn't about making you terrified of a monster breathing down your neck, as much as it is about overcoming that terror. This game is very much an anti-horror game. The protagonist doesn't care if there was the Anima Guardian or Stefano's floating left eye behind him, trying to claw him apart, because he has only one objective: save Lily and escape Mobius. This is particularly what I absolutely love about games like these. You can fight back, and I don't mean in some basic way of having a single pistol the entire game. I mean walking around with an entire arsenal of somewhat modern weapons stacked to the teeth with ammo. I'm over-exaggerating this a little bit, but what makes these horror games so great is how much more the developers have to work to scare the player. If you have a way to fight back, then most monsters won't seemingly faze you at all. The contrast between the cathartic sneak kill from behind in a tense environment compared to the terrifying conglomeration of flesh that chases you around like an absolute maniac is what drives the horror home. It's easier to create just a scary game that makes you completely helpless. But a scary game where you can fight back that still terrifies you is so much harder to do. But the thing that makes me come back to this game, time and time again, is the incredible story and the way it concludes. When you stand on that ashy landscape, listening to the wind go by, as you walk forward through broken down structures, there's something else ringing in the distance. I remember getting to this exact moment here, and taking a break for once, and I distinctly remember the clarity that this melody brought me. It's been here since the beginning, as Sebastian walks through the vast abyss. There's just something about the track making your way home that grips you and pulls you into the moment. It's incredible how games can pull us into the eyes of the protagonist so deeply like this, being able to make you feel so much all at once, and seemingly nothing in another moment. This track is like a sorrow meditation, a cold breath of fresh air, a memory too distant for you to grasp, yet it's grounded, it's here. This is some of Masatoshi Yanagi's best work, somehow capturing exactly what Sebastian must have felt, believing his daughter and wife had died years ago, yet she's here. Both of them are. Years of pain and coping led up to one final moment of him walking up that hill. As he witnesses past events, and as he gets to that house, he has to overcome someone he's missed too much to save the one he loves most. The Evil Within 2 deserved better.